You've had experience as an academic, as an author, and as a National Park Service ranger. So you've seen firsthand how people encounter history, either in the classroom, as readers, or visiting monuments. Why do you think it's important that our institutions get history right and tell history authentically?
My argument for telling a full story about history, which is to say the opposite of a version of history which has been scrubbed, from which the so-called DEI has all been removed. Well, there's a number of arguments for telling the full story. One is, first of all, we just ought to be able to tell the truth. We ought to be able to talk about what happened. But I really want us to think for a moment about what's it mean to take DEI out of history? What's it mean to remove diversity from history? Well, you remove diversity, that's to impose a false uniformity that never existed. That is to erase the experiences of most people who lived in the past. That's what getting rid of the D does. What's it mean to get rid of the E? What's it mean to get rid of equity? Getting rid of equity is the perpetuation of unfair advantage. What's it mean to get rid of inclusion? Well, getting rid of inclusion means exclusion. It means kicking people out. It means making an invidious distinction between an us who count and a them who don't. And it's not just a simple matter of, do you like happy history or sad history? It's a matter of, if you can erase the majority of people who lived through the past from the past, you're effectively erasing them from who counts now, who counts as the people now. And if you can do that, if you can erase who lived in the past, if you can shrink who the us is, it's much easier to take away rights, to take away liberties. Unless we comfort ourselves by thinking, we're fine, we're in the us, we're not in the them. Those are very porous boundaries.
Right.
Once we allow this us-them distinction, we deserve rights and liberties. They don't. No one's are safe. So scrubbing DEI from history is actually dangerous. It's dangerous to the very rights and liberties that we all enjoy. And it's just false. It's just fake. It's to tell a false story that didn't happen. It's not to tell history. It's to tell a fairy tale. It's to tell a lullaby. And that's not what the past is. The past is full and complicated. And most people, I think, have an innate appreciation. I know this from students. I know this from people who took many of my tours when I worked as a park ranger. They really, they don't believe that the past consisted of cardboard cutout figures running around thinking one thought at a time. They're interested in the people. They're interested in the human lives as they were lived in the past. They know their own lives are complicated. They're capable of, in fact, they innately know that the same was true for people in the past too. So if we want to connect with people, if we want them to care about the past, if we want them to think history matters, we do them an enormous disservice if we simplify it, if we drain it, if we make it into this fake, triumphal narrative that resembles nothing in anyone's actual life.
And we know from history that when people come in and try to control people and try to impose their version of the future, one of the first things they do is try to control the past. They try to sanitize and try to control the narrative from the past. So for authoritarian regimes and for dictatorships, controlling the past is important to them, so it should be important for all of us.
Absolutely. I mean, nothing lends legitimacy like old age. So the idea of legitimating the present by pointing to a past precedent is a time-honored, that's a time-honored method. Human societies, human leaders, human groups have done that from time immemorial. So to some degree, what we are seeing these days, these efforts to control a past, sure, it has analogs. It's a thing humans do. Because we know it's a thing humans do, that means humans have to be on guard against it. We have to be alert to it. We have to insist on its opposite. And its opposite is telling a real story about real people's lives in the past. All of them, not just a few.
Right. There's often a confusion where people seem to interpret the bad things, the bad stories, as a source of guilt or somehow very connected to the present.
When we can, as human beings, change, we can make choices, we can have better society.
But if we don't start with an honest and authentic understanding of the past, we don't know where we're coming from. We don't know where we need to correct things.
Right. There's been some conversation lately about this sense of shame and shame as an ingredient in how we talk about the past. And I have a couple of thoughts on that. And one is, well, first of all, I'm not convinced that the past has a job to make us feel anything. I'm much more interested in us thinking about the past than how it makes us feel. I also don't want to discount people's feelings. Of course, people feel how they feel. But I do not believe that a sense of shame is warranted for things we ourselves did not do.
Right.
I think a sense of shame is warranted when we knowingly subvert the narrative. When we decide not to make better choices now, well, that we should be ashamed of. What happened when slave ships first started sailing from Europe to Africa? What happened when land was seized? What happened when people were dispossessed? I didn't do that, and you didn't do that. And so I don't feel like we need to feel shame for that. What we do need to know, though, is but we benefit from the fact that that happened.
Right.
And we need to acknowledge that benefit. When we refuse to acknowledge that benefit, well, that's when we start getting into the territory of things we probably should feel badly about. But how do we acknowledge it? Well, we tell the true story. We tell the whole story. We don't have to go around telling people that they're terrible. But we do just have to ask people to know what the gaps between our aspirations and reality have been in the past. And resolve to try and narrow those gaps now. Can't narrow a gap that you pretend isn't there.
One of the best things about America is how often we've let our words run ahead of our actions. We've let our ideals run ahead of our actions. And that's very human.
Yeah.
And, they talk about the values of liberty and democracy and everything else, and there have been so many times when that's more aspirational than real.
But unless we have an honest accounting for them, unless we have an honest conversation about them, we can't continue to close the gap between the reality and our ideals and our values. It's very important for us to keep chasing after the words we throw out ahead of ourselves.
I agree.
And deleting history sort of takes away the words.
Absolutely.
And takes away the values.
Well, it drains any meaning out of the words, and I would rather keep trying to make them mean something. I agree with you that it is a genuinely unique thing about the United States that it does let its words and its ideals and its values run ahead of its actuality. And there's a school of thought that says, well, that's a problem that leads to triumphalism, and I understand that school of thought. And it's also one of the things I love about the United States because it's risky. It's risky to say that we're based on these ideals when our reality actually hasn't achieved them yet. It's easy to fall short. In fact, it means constant falling short. It means looking a little foolish sometimes. But ideally, it means trying again. It's those ideals, it's stating them that makes us try. And what it seems to me we do when we falsify the past is we give up on even trying. We pretend pretend that these ideals have already been realized, and therefore there's no need for continued effort. There's no need for continued improvement. That's a betrayal. That's when those ideals get betrayed. But to have them, to be glad that they're there, to know that we fall short frequently, the next response to me is not therefore to hang our heads in shame, and the next response is not to cover up what really happened. The next response is to say, okay, what do we do right now to try and narrow the gap in the future?
So what is one thing that individuals or organizations can do to help counter false histories or to counter attempts to sanitize our history?
This is a harder question, and I will admit that I've felt more powerless recently in this regard. I've felt more discouraged recently, genuinely questioning my own, inherent conviction that there really is more that unites us than divides us, however much we manage to screw it up from time to time. Those things I've always believed, and I've had a harder time sticking with those beliefs lately. But here's where I think hope matters, because hope defies logic. Hope will continue not just in the absence of evidence, but in evidence to the contrary. So it's hope. So where do I turn for hope right now? Is in a couple of different places. One, the questions students continue to ask. So what can we do? We can continue to encourage and cultivate questions, and we can continue to answer them honestly. We can continue to answer them in ways that attend to the lived experiences of people in the past and not to our feelings now. That's one thing we can do. I would say we can visit our historic sites. We can just use our vote with our feet to say that these places really do matter, that the National Park Service and state historic sites are national treasures. They belong to all of us. They really do matter. And we can go to them. We can make clear that these places have value and they belong to all of us, and we can insist on them including all of us. I still think writing to Congress members matters, and partly I think that because I teach at Georgetown, and so there's a lot of students here who spend a semester or more working in the office of a congressperson. Oh. I know they listen to those calls.
Yes.
I know they do. And it doesn't, what you call and say to your congressperson doesn't immediately translate into what you want to have happen.
Right.
But it's a conduit. It is still a conduit from public to the federal government. So picking up the phone and calling a member of Congress and talking to the college kid on the other side and letting them know what you think, or writing to your member of Congress, those things I think matter. And then I also think it matters to look for ways to band together, look for ways to work together. There's no real reason why people should listen to me exactly. There's not. But finding each other and sticking up and standing up for each other when an executive order attacks the Smithsonian.
Right.
As an individual, as someone who teaches at Georgetown, I need to stand up and say no. Even if nobody listens.
Right.
I need to stand up and say no. So looking for who's under attack right now, and how do I say no even if nobody listens.
Right.
I think that's what we can do.
So we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And one thing that individuals can do is go to events, and there's going to be a lot of events, but to celebrate the 250th birthday of America.
It's a good time to not be just a spectator.
That's true.
It's important, I think, to do some research, understand the context. So when you go to the event and you experience it, you can make a judgment, and you should make a judgment. Was it inclusive enough? Was it accurate? Did it shade the history toward one side or another? And then it's important that when you make those judgments to speak up. And, I'm old enough to remember when it might be hard to speak up because you kind of had to rely on your letter to the editor, to the local newspaper getting accepted, or somehow getting attention some other way. And you don't have to do that anymore. And in fact, a lot of times the local newspaper isn't even around. There is a lot of good and bad about social media because it's a very human institution. But it is true that it's very easy to speak up. It's very easy to get your voice heard and to find the people that agree with you and find a way to push for something better, push for change in how we commemorate our history.
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning the 250th. I think I had said to you earlier, my earliest memories are of the bicentennial.
Oh, right.
I think that's one of the reasons I think I loved history. My mother is a good sewer, and she made me a little dress, and I thought that was the greatest thing ever, and I've loved history ever since. And I am positive that there were, strengths and weaknesses to the various observances then. I'm, running around in my little dress probably had a million anachronisms to it, but it incited interest.
Right.
And so so being a part of this 250th, making sure that the 250th is us. That it is all of us. That matters. And notice who's doing stuff. So the National Park Service, for example, is doing a lot.
Right.
Current conditions prevent them from from advertising or even really talking to the press about what they are doing. But good, hard-working people are doing a lot to mark this occasion. We can notice them, and we can realize what an institution the National Park Service is, what an institution our local museums are, how they really make us us, and be supportive of their efforts. Lift up those efforts, make sure that they're seen and known, and that's another Richard Congressman thing about. I saw my Park Service stage this reenactment, and it was great.
Right.
Yeah, you can make sure that that one, the work is noticed,
right,
and two, we can publicly say it's valuable. And when it's not, when it falls short, we can say that too. We can say. The revolution wasn't, a polite event where everybody agreed. So disagreement now about the 250th, I see, is fine with me. That does not.
It's totally in the spirit of
yes,
the revolution.
Exactly.
I feel like you said what gives you some hope. It's students asking questions.
Students asking questions. Yeah. The curiosity of people I've encountered as a National Park Service ranger. Those are the biggest. I would say, because here's what they tell me. They tell me that there is an appetite and a readiness for a fuller story. People really can handle it. I don't think Americans are going to crumble and shatter at the first mention of something unsavory in the past.
Right.
I just don't think they are.
And I think it's the complexity, it's the flaws, it's the humanness of people in history that draw people in. I think if you take a stick figure version of history where everyone is either a hero or a villain, that's not very compelling. That would not make a good Netflix series. But it's the way we're flawed and still are able to achieve sometimes amazing things is what draws people in and keeps them engaged and makes them want to hear the story. Makes them want to read history.
Exactly. I think it's empowering too, because if we turn the founders or anybody in the past into these cardboard cutouts or stick figures, it feels unattainable. There's no way I can achieve anything.
Right.
Like, I've got nothing in common with that person. But it is empowering to realize, to me, I think, these were fundamentally flawed human beings, as all human beings are. These were complicated people made up of mixed motives, and yet look at what they accomplished.
Right.
Despite any weaknesses or flaws or mixed motives, despite their disagreements with each other. Well, if they could, there's no reason why we can't.
Right.
If they could bridge the divides between 13 colonies that had very little in common with each other, and were only half of Britain's 26 colonies, many had much more in common with, South Carolina had a lot more in common with Barbados than it did with Philadelphia. And yet they bridged those divides. And if they could do it, it's possible. And if it's possible, we can do it too.
Right.
And so there's something empowering and deeply inspiring to me about honestly engaging with the shortcomings of people in the past, with complication people in the past, with just human complexity, with mixed motives, with disagreement.
Right.
And we look back at these people because of what they did, because of what was accomplished, and tend to think of them as extraordinary people who had rare gifts and talents. But in fact, more often than not, they were just ordinary people who were just trying to do right, struggling to make the best of a bad situation. And they get this reputation later on because of what was accomplished, because of how they worked together, and how things just went.
Exactly. And it's the work that work together is super important too. There isn't one who figured it out. There wasn't one idea and poof, that solved everything. What usually worked was contrasting ideas that had to be reconciled somehow.
Right.
And it was in the process of finding a way to reconcile these contrasting ideas that solutions emerged.